and the skies are gray. I've been full of in the such a winter day. I've been safe and warm. If I was in the lake, California dreaming, oh, in such a winter day.
Do you admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
I'm asking you the questions, my friend.
In June of 1984, the residents of Los Angeles were about to get a glimpse of the monster who would terrorize their community. 79-year-old Jenny Vinkel lived in an apartment building in Eagle Rock, California, in East LA. Jenny had moved to California from Brooklyn 3 years prior after a fight with one of her sons who was battling a mental illness. She hadn't spoken to him since. Her other son, 47-year-old Jack Vinkel, lived in the same apartment building and would check in on her daily. On the morning of June 28th, Jack went to check in on his mother. He had just seen her the afternoon before. He noticed that a screen on one of her windows had been removed. He then tried her front door and noticed that it was unlocked. With growing concern, he walked in, calling her name. He noticed that all of her belongings were tossed around the apartment and everything was in complete disarray. As he continued calling for her, he walked into her bedroom and saw blood all over the room and his mother dead on the bed. Jack started screaming for help and running through the apartment complex, asking people to call 911 and screaming that his mother had been murdered. When police arrived, they were able to lift a single fingerprint off of the window screen. In 1984, their technology was very limited, and with only one fingerprint, they were unable to identify Jenny's attacker. Not many people would argue that Richard Ramirez was a monster. However, if there was ever a perfect recipe for a serial killer, Richard had every ingredient. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His parents, Julian and Mercedes, were Mexican immigrants, and Richard was the youngest of 5 siblings. When Richard's mother was pregnant with him, she worked in a boot factory and was exposed to toxic fumes. Although there's no concrete proof that it was related to her work conditions, all of Richard's siblings were born with some type of health problem. When Richard was 2, a dresser fell on his head and gave him a concussion. When he was 5, his sister accidentally hit him in the head with a swing, knocking him unconscious. After the second head injury, he began suffering from seizures. If that weren't traumatic enough, Richard's father, Julian, was an alcoholic who would fly into rages and abuse Richard and the other members of his family. By the time he was 12, he was sleeping in a cemetery at night and spending more and more time with his Uncle Mike and Aunt Jessie to try to escape his volatile household. Unfortunately, Uncle Mike seemed to be a psychopath. Mike had come back from the Vietnam War and would show Richard photos of tortured, brutalized, and dismembered people. Richard found himself aroused by the pictures, and the Richard Ramirez that would later terrorize California during the summer of 1984 and 85 was born. Richard was interested in true crime from a young age. He was fascinated by Jack the Ripper as a child and read all about the Ripper's specific methods of killing and wearing all black. He loved 80s slasher films, but his favorite movie of all time was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Richard witnessed his Uncle Mike beating his aunt many times. On May 4th, 1973, when he was only 13, he was hanging out with his uncle at the kitchen table when his aunt walked in and started nagging his Uncle Mike about getting a job. Mike then killed her right in front of Richard. In shock, Richard said nothing when he got home that night. After witnessing his aunt's murder, Richard, who was already a loner, completely withdrew and started heavily using cocaine and LSD. In fact, Richard used so much LSD that his friends and family would later blame that for the horrific crimes that he committed. He became obsessed with heavy metal, specifically AC/DC, and declared that he was a Satanist. He moved in with his sister Ruth and her husband Roberto. Roberto was a pervert who enjoyed window peeping in his spare time. Richard's bad luck of living with morally bankrupt people continued. Roberto would frequently take Richard with him on his nightly peeping Tom activities. Unfortunately, Uncle Mike was found not guilty for his wife's murder by reason of insanity. He was released and resumed his close relationship with Richard, who was now 17. He was said to have the biggest influence on Richard's life. In 1981, Richard Ramirez moved to LA. In order to support his drug habit, he committed petty theft, eventually moving on to stealing cars. Just like his father, he would have frequent emotional outbursts and fits of rage. In 1983, he was arrested for stealing a car and had a short sentence. With his release in 1984, began his reign of terror for the residents of California. All was seemingly quiet for the next 9 months after Jenny Vinkau's brutal murder. That is, up until the night of March 17, 1985. The summer of 1985 was scorching hot in Los Angeles. The heat wave was so oppressive that many people were sleeping with their windows open to get a slight hint of relief. 22-year-old Maria Hernandez was returning home to her condo in the LA suburb of Rosemead at 11:30 p.m. She lived there with 34-year-old Dale Okazaki. Dale had spent the evening at her parents' house watching TV and updating them on her new promotion to traffic supervisor with LA County. She had just returned to the condo and was standing in the kitchen when she heard the garage door go up. Maria had been at her boyfriend's house that night and was pulling into their garage. As Maria stepped out of the car, she heard a noise and looked up. A tall, dark figure was standing in the shadows and had slapped the hood of her car to get her attention. He was pointing a .22 caliber directly at her. Without saying a word, he pulled the trigger. As an instinct, she raised her hands up to protect her face, and the bullet miraculously ricocheted off of her keys. Maria felt a hot flash and fell to the ground behind her car door. The intruder assumed she was dead and walked into their condo. The lights were dim inside. Dale had heard the gunshot and crouched down behind the kitchen counter. The intruder stood perfectly still, waiting for her to peek out from her hiding spot. As Dale peeked her head over the counter, he killed her. Maria was worried about her roommate, so she got up and decided to enter the condo through the front door. She assumed that the man who shot her would leave the same way he came in. As she approached the front door, she came face to face with the killer. She begged for her life, and he took off running. As he was fleeing their condo, he encountered his third victim that night, 30-year-old Tsai Lian Yu. Ramirez was already full of adrenaline and rage and was infuriated by Miss Yu's driving. He forced her off the road, screamed at her, and then shot her. Witnesses saw the entire incident and were able to describe him to investigators. 10 days later, the killer entered the home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara in Whittier, California. Vincent was a 64-year-old retired investment counselor and owned a pizza parlor a few blocks away from their home. His 44-year-old wife, Maxine, was an attorney and sang in their church choir. The Zazzaras lived in a ranch-style home in the San Gabriel Valley. Late that evening, the Night Stalker snuck in through an unlocked door and crept into their living room. This was the night that Ramirez perfected his killing style. He shot Vincent as he slept on the living room couch. Maxine woke up to the sound of the gunshot. Richard entered their bedroom and bound Maxine and began ransacking their house looking for valuables. What Richard didn't count on was that Maxine was no wallflower. She was strong-willed, and her fear was being pushed aside by anger. Maxine worked on her restraints as Richard was rifling through their things. Their house had been broken into before, and they had a loaded shotgun under their bed. In one swift movement, Maxine slipped her hands free and slid off of the bed. She reached down, grabbed their shotgun, and pointed it straight at the tall, sweaty man looking through their drawers. Richard instinctively turned around, and Maxine pulled the trigger. To her horror, she realized the gun wasn't loaded. She suddenly remembered that her husband had emptied it when their grandkids were visiting earlier in the week. Richard's disbelief quickly turned to rage. He pulled out his .22 and shot her 3 times. As would become routine for Ramirez, he would spend time in his victim's house after he murdered them. He liked to relish the thoughts of what he just did and relive it over and over. After having a shotgun pulled on him, Richard was rattled for the rest of the night and knew he could never let that happen again. After no one had heard from the Zazzaras in 2 days, a business associate came over to check on them and found them dead. When investigators arrived, they found an Avia footprint under Maxine's window. After Richard left the Zazzara residence, he returned to the Cecil Hotel in Skid Row in downtown LA. The Cecil Hotel was already infamous for its incredibly dark history of drugs, violence, and mysterious murders. He removed his clothing, threw it in the hotel dumpster, and walked through his temporary home at the No-Tell Motel in his underwear, with no one giving it a second thought. Richard Ramirez decided that he wanted to join the ranks of the worst and most feared serial killers in history. He even gave up his beloved cocaine, fearing that it would make him get sloppy and wind up getting him caught. He was getting good at his new passion, and he was convinced that Satan was protecting him. 66-year-old Bill Doy and 56-year-old Lillian Doy lived in a quaint yellow home on Trumbauer Avenue. Bill, who had just retired, had just purchased a van so that he and Lillian could travel together. Bill was known as being a very hard worker with a great sense of humor. Lillian had just had a stroke 2 years prior and was now bound to a wheelchair. On the night of May 14th, the air was hot and thick, and it had just started raining. Ramirez was slinking around the Doy's residence, checking all of the doors and windows and looking for an entrance point. He noticed that one of the rear windows was open. He popped the screen and jumped in without making a sound. Richard pulled out his gun, and Bill heard him and sprang into action. He lunged for the gun that they kept in the nightstand by their bed. Ramirez was much faster, and he shot Bill before he could get to it. He then restrained Lillian and went through their home, taking all of their jewelry and electronics. After Ramirez left, Bill managed enough strength to get to the phone and call 911. At 5 a.m., while Richard was driving back to his dingy hotel, excited and going over all of the details of what he had just done, emergency responders were rushing Bill Doy to the hospital, trying to save his life. Bill was pronounced dead at 5:29 a.m. Investigators found an Avia shoe print in the wet ground outside the Doy's window. Unfortunately, since the Monterey Park PD was uncooperative with the LA detectives Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno, who were working the other cases, the murders remained unconnected. The Night Stalker seemed to be ramping up the frequency and brazenness of his attacks. Just 2 weeks later, on May 29th, he drove a stolen vehicle to Monrovia and decided on the home of elderly sisters Mabel Bell and Florence Lang. The two sisters had lived in their modest ranch home for the past 25 years. Their house was situated on a secluded road with only one close neighbor. Mabel didn't want her sister in any type of institution, so she took her in so that she could take care of her. Despite the fact that her health wasn't what it used to be, Mabel still drove around town and went to play bridge with her friends several times a week. Around midnight on May 29th, the Night Stalker entered their home through an unlocked door. He bound and beat them both, and then using Mabel's red lipstick, he drew a pentagram on her thigh and the walls of both bedrooms. The next day, their gardener arrived to care for their rose garden and saw their door open. Concerned, he went inside and discovered the sisters in their bedrooms, both comatose. Mabel later died 6 weeks later from her injuries. Florence survived but would never speak again and was hospitalized for the remainder of her life. The next day, he drove to Burbank and broke into the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle. Carol was home that night with her 11-year-old son. Her 16-year-old daughter had fortunately spent the night at a friend's house. Ramirez couldn't find any unlocked windows or doors, so he stuck his arm up into the dog door, reached up, and unlocked the back door. After he broke in, he woke up both Carol and her son. He then took her son around the house, helping himself to anything he could steal. He repeatedly assaulted Carol, but left both Carol and her son alive and handcuffed to each other. On July 2nd, the heat was so heavy and oppressive that it was almost unbearable. The summer of 1985 was the hottest summer LA had seen in 100 years. Ramirez was growing restless and needed a fresh victim. On this night, he decided on Arcadia. Being overcome with his desire to kill again, he decided on 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon's house. Mary was peacefully sleeping in her bedroom when the killer removed a lamp from a table and entered her bedroom. He then struck her repeatedly with it. She was found the next day by her neighbors, who were concerned when they saw her screen laying in her yard. Investigators found a partial Avia footprint at the crime scene. They knew now that they were dealing with one of the worst serial killers that they had ever seen. Richard knew that people were hypervigilant and that the police would be looking for him everywhere. He made sure he disguised his appearance and chose a different area to do his hunting. He drove to a neighborhood in Sierra Madre in the San Gabriel Mountains. 16-year-old Whitney Bennett had been out with her friends earlier on the night of July 5th. After she got home, she changed into her pajamas and settled into bed. After 2 a.m., Ramirez spotted the teenager sleeping soundly from outside her window. He was excited that he had found his next victim. He carefully removed the screen and discovered that the window was unlocked. He climbed in her room with a tire iron in hand. He approached Whitney's bed and then struck her in the head multiple times. He then ransacked her room and stole some of her jewelry. He grabbed an electrical cord and decided to strangle Whitney. The cord began to spark and it created blue smoke. Richard thought that he was watching Whitney's soul leave her body. Taking this as a sign from God, he dropped the cord and fled Whitney's room. When Whitney woke up with a pounding headache, she had no idea what had happened to her. She screamed for her parents and then collapsed. After Whitney was taken to the hospital, Detectives Salerno and Carrillo then went to Whitney's residence. They were shocked at the brutality of the scene and they felt that it was the Night Stalker. One of the crime analysts found a bloody Avia footprint on her bedspread that matched the others, and they knew it was their man. They also knew that he wasn't going to stop until he was either in jail or dead. In one of the many interesting caveats to this story, Whitney Bennett attended the retirement party in 1993 for Detective Frank Salerno. At that party, she met Frank's son. The two exchanged numbers, started dating, and are now married with 3 kids. July 7th would illustrate just how unhinged the Night Stalker had become. Richard decided to return to Monterey Park, despite the fact that this area was particularly hot for him because of his past assaults. He chose the well-cared-for, yellow-hued ranch home of 61-year-old grandmother Joyce Nelson. Joyce was a fiercely independent and active woman who lived alone. Joyce had been a single mother and worked very hard to give her kids a good life. She loved to take care of her home and spend time with her family. Ramirez climbed into Joyce's home through an unlocked window. He spotted Joyce sleeping on the couch. He woke her up and told her to do exactly what he said and she would live. As he began to try and pull her from the living room towards the bedrooms, she began to fight him. Infuriated, he beat her to death. He then stole her jewelry and some electronics and walked out her front door. Her son later commented that it gave him at least some comfort to know that she had fought until her last breath. After leaving Joyce Nelson's home, Ramirez was in a rage over the fact that Joyce had resisted him. He pulled onto another side street not far away and chose yet another small, yellow house. Reaching through the dog door, he unlocked the door and walked inside. The home belonged to 63-year-old Sophie Dickman. After assaulting her and stealing her jewelry, he left her handcuffed and she was able to pull the bed to the window and call for help. By this time, the residents of Los Angeles knew that they had a satanic-worshipping, vicious serial killer on the loose. Gun sales and the demand for security systems went through the roof. The media was reporting on all of the graphic details, and the public was understandably terrified. Richard was following his own crimes on the news. In late July, he was walking down a street near his hotel when he glanced over at a newspaper stand and stopped in his tracks. He couldn't believe that the police had now connected all of the attacks. He knew that he would have to be even more cautious, but he also felt the strong protection of Satan. On July 20th, Richard was feeling the familiar anxiety that he had when he needed another victim. This time he decided on Glendale and chose yet another yellow home. Richard was excited because it was foggy out and he knew he wouldn't be seen. He chose the home of Max and Leila Knighting. Max was 68 and Leila was 66. He wanted to up his game as far as shocking the public. Leila and Max knew all about the Night Stalker and had been taking extra precautions in making sure their home was secure at night. Ramirez cut a screen on one of the doors, reached in and unlocked it. He snuck into their bedroom, flipped on the light, and screamed to wake them up. He then killed them almost instantly. Richard decided he wasn't done for the night and drove north to Sun Valley. This time he chose the home of Chainarong and Somkid Kovananth. They were immigrants from Thailand and had been in LA for 10 years. They had an 8-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter. Ramirez slipped in through an unlocked door and crept inside. He killed Chainarong while he slept in bed. He assaulted Somkid and made her swear to Satan as he stole all of the money and jewelry that he could find. Once again, he left an Avia footprint at the scene. These latest murders brought the public's panic to a fever pitch.
Officials in Los Angeles are offering a $10,000 reward for information leading to the capture of the so-called Night Stalker. He's the sadistic killer wanted for a series of murders and rapes. KNBC's Phil Schuman reports.
The same man is suspected in 6 to 8 murders and 25 to 30 attacks. The latest victim, a 35-year-old man, shot in the head last Thursday. Now dubbed the Night Stalker, the crime spree covers 50 miles. The suspect varies the time, place, and type of attack, but he always enters through an open door or window. Though there is a large task force working on this case, investigators believe the so-called Night Stalker will be caught because of a tip from the public. To help motivate someone to come forward, Los Angeles County officials have authorized a $10,000 reward. In Los Angeles, Phil Schuman reporting for NBC News.
On August 6th, Chris and Virginia Peterson were sleeping soundly in their bed. Virginia was a light sleeper and heard the metal click of Richard's weapon in the dark. He charged towards their bed and shot them both. Despite his serious injuries, adrenaline took over and Chris jumped out of bed and wrestled the Night Stalker and then chased him out of the house. Miraculously, both Chris and Virginia survived the attack. Just 2 days later, on August 8th, the killer decided on Diamond Bar. This time he chose the home of Elias and Sakina Abuwath. They had a 3-year-old and a 10-week-old baby. Richard slipped in through the back door and made his way back to their bedroom. He shot Elias, killing him instantly. He then assaulted Sakina and demanded all of their valuables. Based on the crime scene and her description of the attack, investigators knew it had to be the Night Stalker. With all of the news coverage, Richard decided it would be best to leave town for a while. He decided to head north to San Francisco. He checked into a hotel in the Tenderloin district and began fantasizing about his next kill. Peter and Barbara Pan lived in a modest 2-story yellow home on Eucalyptus Street near Lake Merced. Peter was 66 and his wife was 62. They had immigrated to the U.S. from Hong Kong in 1969. On the night of August 18th, they had gone to bed and left a window open to get some relief from the heat. As fate would have it, the Night Stalker had randomly decided on their home that night. He cut the screen and entered the home. He quietly walked back to their bedroom and pulled out his .25. He shot and killed them both, and then, just like at Mabel and Florence's home, he used red lipstick to draw a pentagram on the wall. Detectives Salerno and Carrillo got on a plane and flew to San Francisco. They recognized the telltale signs of the Night Stalker, and they knew that he was in San Francisco.
California's newest serial killer has reportedly struck in San Francisco. The so-called Night Stalker is blamed for 7 murders in the Los Angeles area. Now, police have linked the killer to a murder in San Francisco last weekend. Police say the only common thread in the killings is the time of day. The Night Stalker apparently picks his victims at random, entering their homes after dark through unlocked doors.
Lock your doors, lock your windows. If you have the ability to provide additional security devices, then by all means do so.
Who wants to be next? I don't. No one else does.
Mayor Feinstein held a press conference, and to Salerno and Carrillo's horror, she proceeded to give away the only leads they had: the Avia shoe and the ballistics. The Night Stalker was watching, and he knew he had to make some changes. He also realized that things were too hot for him in San Francisco, and on August 25th, he went back to LA. The Ramirez family spent the weekend of August 24th and 25th on a camping trip in Mexico. They had just returned from their trip and were settling back into their Mission Viejo home late that afternoon. Their 13-year-old son, James, had slept most of the way back, so he was having trouble falling asleep later that night. Even though it was after 1 a.m., the heat was still stifling. After playing some video games, James decided he wanted his pillow out of their camper outside. He walked outside into the darkness and tried to get into the camper, but it was locked. As he turned to walk back into the house, he heard a noise coming from the backyard. He walked down the gravel path that led down the side of their house to the backyard and tried to look around the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. Thinking it was just an animal, he walked back up the path and into their garage through the side door. He saw his bike in the corner of the garage and decided to work on the brakes since he couldn't sleep. He flipped on the garage light and began working on his bike. As he was crouched down, he heard another noise. This time, it seemed to be coming closer. He suddenly heard distinct footsteps coming down the side of the house on the gravel path. He froze and looked through the vent in the wall and saw a man's shoes standing directly on the other side. He knew that since the lights were on, the man could see directly inside of the garage. He quickly ducked behind the family car and went through his options. If the man came into the garage, he would be trapped. He decided that his only option was to make a run for it. James stood up and bolted past the man and into his house. He ran immediately into his bedroom and looked out his window. The prowler was walking directly in front of his window, and he got a decent look at him. His father had woken up after hearing him run around the house and yelled at him, asking him why he was still awake. James ran into his parents' bedroom and told them that there was a prowler outside. His dad immediately called 911. James ran outside just in time to see the man sprint to an orange Toyota and start to pull away. He was able to get most of the license plate. The police arrived right away and began looking around the property. 2 hours later, at 3:30 a.m., the police called the Ramirez family and insisted on speaking to James. They asked him questions about what the man looked like. He remembered that he was wearing a black members-only jacket and a black baseball cap. James didn't realize at the time that he had just given the police one of the biggest leads to catch the Night Stalker. He also didn't know that after the man in the orange car had driven away, he found his next victims less than 2 miles away from their home. Not far away, 29-year-old computer repairman Bill Carnes had also been up late working in his garage. He had spoken to his mother earlier that night, and she warned him that there was a sick man breaking into houses and begged him to lock all of his doors and windows. It was still 99 degrees outside at midnight, so he ignored her warning and left one of his living room windows open and went to bed. Like so many other victims of Richard Ramirez, Bill lived in a one-level yellow house with his girlfriend. As they slept soundly, the Night Stalker quietly climbed into the house and made his way towards the bedroom. He walked over to the bed and shot Bill 3 times in the head and neck. He then assaulted his fiancée. He made her declare her love for Satan, but he left her alive. Miraculously, Bill survived the attack, but was not told that he was shot by the Night Stalker until months afterwards. Doctors were concerned it would be too upsetting and affect his recovery. After the attack on Bill and his fiancée, the Night Stalker drove to a shopping center and dumped the orange Toyota. He wiped everything down but missed one fingerprint on the rearview mirror.
Police thought that the murder of a young woman last March was an isolated act of violence, but since then they've come to believe it was connected to a wide-ranging series of assaults by a killer who's become known as the Night Stalker, a killer who apparently struck again during the weekend. We have a report from Nadine Berger.
Police today continue to search for any clues in the near-fatal shooting of 29-year-old William Carnes and of his girlfriend. They're apparently the latest victims of the Night Stalker, thought to be responsible now for 34 brutal attacks, 14 of them fatal. Just as before, the assailant entered a house in a quiet middle-class neighborhood in the pre-dawn hours on Sunday through an unlocked window and attacked the couple while they slept. Neighbors are terrified.
Guy just sleep with my hand on right by my bed and a sawed-off shotgun, which I always have.
Meanwhile, with the fingerprint being processed and other hot leads that were coming in, investigators were closing in on the Night Stalker. Richard could once again feel the pressure, and he left to go visit his brother in Arizona. The print was sent to Sacramento, and they finally got a result: Ricardo Munoz Ramirez. Investigators held a press conference and released his photo to the press. Richard's photo was on the cover of every newspaper in California. Richard had no idea that they had identified him and that his photo was given to the public. His brother wasn't home, so on August 30th, he got on a bus back to LA and decided to go visit another brother in East LA. When he got off the bus, he headed towards Mike's liquor store. As he was standing at the cash register, he noticed some women staring at him with horrified looks on their faces. He heard one of them whisper, "El Matador," which translates to "the killer." He looked down and saw his face on the cover of the paper and left the store in a panic. The store owner called the police, and police cruisers and helicopters were immediately dispatched to the area. Richard heard the sirens and ran across the freeway and into a residential area. He started jumping fences and running across yards as the residents began hitting him with barbecue utensils and chasing him down.
Years ago, the then just identified but yet to be caught Night Stalker made the mistake of coming here to East LA's Hubbard Street. Spotted and chased, Ramirez jumped a wall into the backyard of the Pinon family, where Faustino was under his car working on the transmission, this same vintage Mustang he still has.
He said, "I'm not taking this car." "You ain't taking nothing, boy. You ain't taking nothing, boy."
Pinon tried to stop him, but Ramirez forced his way inside the car, then crashed into the side of the house.
My girls came out and started screaming and seeing the father fighting with this man.
That brought out Jose Burgoyne and his sons Julio and Jaime. More neighbors joined the chase, and finally they tackled Ramirez.
Tried to get up a couple of times, but he just were too many of us around him.
And he was saying, "Let me go."
Yeah, he goes, "Let me go." They're chasing me.
Arriving authorities bandaged Ramirez and put him in the back of a patrol car, an image captured by the first newsman on the scene, NBC4's Dino Castro.
That's when he looked right at me at the camera, and that's when the hair in the back of my neck stood up because I thought I was looking at evil. It was like, oh, that's him. That's really him.
And I began to search him. Richard Ramirez is sweating. He had been running for a long distance. And so when I touched him, he was all wet. And plus he had blood on his, bleeding from his head.
Remember, he was drenched in sweat. He was breathing heavily, taking large breaths of air.
He hooked him up, he handcuffed him. Then about a minute later, we come along. And so we're just kind of figuring out what we had. Kept telling him, "That's Richard Ramirez." He didn't believe me. He said, "That's not Richard, that's the Night Stalker." So then the ambulance showed up, and then some other police cars showed up, and then all of a sudden, it's like the neighborhood started coming alive. Everybody's coming out saying, "Hey, that's Richard Ramirez. That's the Night Stalker." We turn around, there's like 1,000 people standing around, and people are saying, "Let's get him. Somebody should shoot him."
If I lose control of this crowd, there's a good likelihood they're going to take him from the car because they were convinced it was him, even though I had no specific facts that it was him. But the crowd behaved and were, conducting themselves as though it was him. So I could just notice the hostility in the crowd.
The deputy sheriff arrives and he's placed under arrest at that point.
Suddenly, it was all over. Ironically, after 6 months of chasing the Night Stalker, the police had to step in and save the serial killer's life.
Happy to announce that the individual we have in custody is Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Ramirez was taken to Hollenbeck Police Station. An angry mob descended on the building.
The entire Hollenbeck Police Station was surrounded with citizens. 10 deep. It's like a scene from the Old West when they were going to lynch whoever was in there.
We
we're happy to announce that the individual we have in custody is Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
I can't begin to tell you how proud we, all of us, are of the people in this community who, to a man and a woman, were involved in trying to track this guy down and capture him.
After the police had Ramirez in the patrol car, they took him to the police station. As he was led from the car, he vomited, and the witnesses described it as bright green, just like in the Exorcist movie. They took it as yet another sign that he was pure evil. Richard was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries. He pled not guilty to his charges. During his trial, there were dozens of groupies and Satanists clad in all black who packed the courtroom and the halls to catch a glimpse of their hero, the Night Stalker. The founder of the Church of Satan and author of the Satanic Bible, Anton LaVey, sent his daughter Zena to visit Richard in jail. She told him that the church was praying to Satan for him and that they were making him an honorary member. Richard was honored.
I know that he's a nice person because I've met him, and I know.
He's convicted of 13 murders.
I know. But he's really a nice guy. It's very out of the usual. It's very out of the norm to be able to do that for a certain amount of time and length, a period of time, and get away with it. Especially the outrageousness of it, the kind of murders that he did. When I went to go visit him, I asked him, I said, how many other girls visit you? I want to know. And he kind of laughed and said, there's 2, but I already know them, and I've known them for a while, and they're just like acquaintances, and, kind of, made me think that and believe like I was like the only one that he liked that was visiting him.
Their attraction may be difficult to explain, but from Los Angeles to San Francisco, they stalk Ramirez whenever he appears in a courtroom.
How do you respond to people who are going to think you're crazy for this?
I'll just say that they just don't understand.
We're a family, and like every family, we have feelings, and people are talking about us without me even knowing us.
You look like you're about to cry.
I know. I am.
How do you keep going?
Faith in God.
Arriving this morning was the Ramirez family from El Paso, Texas, obviously distraught and short-tempered under the glare of cameras.
Your number's coming up.
Later, Julian Ramirez expressed regret for his outburst. It was mid-afternoon when his brother Richard finally appeared in court, smiling toward his mother, who sat quietly in the packed room for attorney fees.
They're very satisfied with the defense so far. Yeah, they've been doing a good job as far as our whole family is concerned.
Richard's trial was continuously delayed due to bickering between the prosecution and the defense. The long-awaited trial for the Night Stalker finally started in January of 1989. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges. On November 7th, 1989, he was sentenced to death.
It was safe.
Richard responded to his fate in the gas chamber with, "Hey, big deal. Death always came with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland."
This trial is a joke.
Would the jury in the above entitled action find the defendant, Richard Ramirez, guilty of murder?
He was then shipped off to San Quentin prison to spend the rest of his days. 41-year-old Doreen Loy saw Richard on the news shortly after his arrest and was immediately smitten. She wrote him 75 letters while he was incarcerated. In 1988, Richard proposed to her, and in October of '96, they were married in the prison. Doreen steadfastly stated that she believed that Richard was innocent. Doreen's family disowned her over the marriage. In 2009, advances in technology enabled investigators to connect Ramirez via DNA to the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Mei Lung in San Francisco. After he was connected to the murder, Doreen, unable to deny his guilt, filed for divorce. Despite being on death row, awaiting his day in the gas chamber, Richard Ramirez died on June 7, 2013, from complications from cancer.
Died earlier this month at 53 after spending nearly 30 years on death row in San Quentin. The Marin County Coroner's Office now says the cause was a blood cancer called B-cell lymphoma. His condition was made worse by hepatitis and chronic substance abuse. Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders in the 1980s.
Witnesses who saw him in the hospital that day described his skin as being a shockingly green hue right before he passed. A witness described him as looking like a green highlighter. Despite the medical explanation due to his liver failure, the fear and superstitions surrounding Richard Ramirez and the pure evil that consumed him live on to present day.
I'll tell you what, after this episode with Richard, I truly, truly believe that the devil is alive and well, and evil was Richard was a manifestation of this. And, you know, I mean, just, you know, I've looked straight in the eye of just absolute evil, and it's, you walk away from it changed.
There is no protection against a mad killer, a mass murderer. And serial killers and most killers in general have a dead conscience. Satan is a stabilizing force in my life. There is a part of me that does believe in him.
To join in the discussion on this case and others, join us every Wednesday for True Crime and Wine Wednesdays, only available through Patreon.